Now, this afternoon, Ghana is to begin engagement with the International Monetary Fund as the country seeks the fund's support for an economic program. In a statement cited by Joy News, the Information Minister, Kojo Nkrumah, says President Akufo-Addo has already had a telephone conversation with the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, conveying government's decision to engage the fund. We'll show you a copy of that statement shortly, but first, here is the Deputy Finance Minister, Dr. John Kuma, insisting that Ghana will not go back to the IMF.
Mr. Speaker, the yield levy is also going to help with the fiscal consolidation effort and reduce the debt levels of our country. And that also means that we are going to see an improved economic ratings and not returning to the International Monetary Fund, which is the only solution our friends on the other side have always preferred. Why don't you go to the IMF? Go to the IMF. We have shown that we have alternatives to building the economy of this country without resorting to conditionalities that will be imposed on this country. We will not go to the IMF today, we will not go to IMF tomorrow, and we are not going as long as the NPP remains in power. Mr. Speaker, looking beyond the yield levy, government is further taking steps to cushion Ghanaians against the hardship caused as a result of the twin crisis of COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war. To this end, fuel prices are expected to go down by 1 cedi following the engagement between the Ghana Chamber of Bulk Oil Distributors, the Bank of Ghana, and the Ministry of Finance. Government has also taken some haircut by cutting expenditures, discretionary expenditures up to 30%, 50% cut in fuel coupons for government appointees, imposing moratorium on importation of imported cars, among several others. Mr. Speaker, if anybody has the capacity to bring this nation back on its economic track, it is Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo and the MPP government. Mr. Speaker, we have done it before. In 2001, when our friends took us and left Ghana in Hippic, it was former President Kufuor and the MPP government that took this country's economy and built it into a lower middle income until 2009. By the time we gave it back to them, in 2017, when President Akufo-Addo came, they had taken us back to IMF. It is President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo who took us out of IMF and grew the economy of this country consistently from 2017 to 2019 on a GDP growth of 7%. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Erifoboku was talking about our debt. The 222 billion extra debt on your 122 billion, half of it is the liabilities you left. Financial sector bailout alone was 21.5 billion. The IPPs, the doomsday problems you left, the take or pay contract, that alone was 30 billion. The exchange rate effect is about 48 billion. We also inherited undisbursed loans. When you add all that, you are over 100 billion of the 222 billion.
But today, we understand that the president is already speaking to Kristalina Georgieva, who is the MD for the IMF. So what changed? On your screens now is a copy of the statement signed by the Information Minister, Kojo Nkrumah. And now, according to the statement, the President of the Republic, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, has authorized Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta to commence formal engagement with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, inviting the fund to support an economic program put together by the government of Ghana. Now, this follows a telephone conversation between the president and the IMF Managing Director, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, conveying Ghana's decision to engage the fund. At a meeting on June 30th, 2022, Cabinet indicated its support for the decision. The engagement with the IMF will seek to provide balance of payment support as part of a broader effort to quicken Ghana's build back in the face of challenges induced by the COVID-19 pandemic and recently the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And it's signed by Honorable Kojo Nkrumah, who is Minister for Information. Now, it's clear that we're going back to the IMF. But what kind of program is government likely to enter this time? My colleague Kofi Eje is with our research desk, and he joins me in studio to shed more light on this. First, Kofi, how many times has Ghana even been to the IMF?
Well, we've been to the IMF 16 times. So
16 times.
Yeah, exactly.
16.
Since 1966, we've been to the IMF 16 times.
Interesting.
And the last time we went to the IMF was in September, how do you call it? 2015. That's when we went to the IMF under the Mahama government. Now, we've had 16 programs under the IMF. And then, just like I said, the last time we went to the IMF was that was 3rd April 2015, and we exited the program somewhere on 2nd April 2019. So more or less like a 4-year period. That was that was our 16 program under the IMF, in Ghana.
Are we likely to predict the sort of program we'll be entering this time around?
So we tracked, and IMF has about 9 products, or what we call the programs. And usually under this 16 program that Ghana has gone in for, most of them have been either the ECF, which is quite for middle and low income countries, and we've also going in for what we call the standby arrangement, which is also for middle income country. But Ghana now is a middle income country, so probably we qualify for a standby arrangement, not so much for an ECF, because since 1988, out of the 16 programs that we've gone in for, the last 6 of them, or at least the last 6 of them, have been the ECF. And so we've been blending at least 3 of them. We've been blending the extended credit facility we call the ECF. We also have the structural adjustments facility, and then the standby arrangement. So at least 4 of them, and we also have the extended facility program under the IMF. But there's actually one reason why at the moment Ghana would have to go back to the IMF. So we've been doing some comparative analysis. We've been comparing the 2015 situation to the 2022 situation. What were some of the indicators that the then Mahama administration had to look at and say, look, this is the time for us to go to the IMF. So if you look at exchange rate then, it was somewhere around the dollar, the CD had lost about 19.9% to the dollar. And then now, as of April 2022, the CD has lost about 15.8% to the dollar. If you look at inflation...
So the previous one was 19%.
Exactly.
And now we're doing 15%, which is close. And that's by April. We are in July now.
Exactly. So if you also look at inflation then, when the Mahama administration had to take that decision to go to the IMF, inflation was around 16.9%, and now we are doing 27.6%. So look at the difference.
Way above
exactly. And if you look at another very, very important indicator, what we call the gross international reserve, that is the amount of foreign currency that you have to do business outside your domestic market. Then it was around 4.8 billion cedis, and it could afford us somewhere around 3.3 months of import cover. So it means what we had could afford us slightly above 3 months of import cover. Then now we have 8.3, but we ask ourselves, how long can it sustain us in the foreign markets? This is just about 3.7, import cover. So 3.3 2015, 3.7 now. So there's not, much difference between what we had in 2015. Another one we also have to look at was the debt to GDP ratio. In 2015 and what we have now. In 2015, before we went to the IMF, the debt to GDP ratio of Ghana was somewhere around 66.5%. Now we are doing 78%. That's according to the Bank of Ghana's own summary data. Another one that we also have to look at is what we call the GDP growth rate in the first quarter. So the first quarter GDP growth rate in 2015 was somewhere around 10.8%, and now we are doing 3.3. So then it was better for the first quarter, but now 3.3, maybe at the back of COVID, and you have this Russia-Ukraine tension and other things.
Now, I've heard many experts who say we have delayed going to the IMF. I mean, what implication does that have on the country?
Well, going to the IMF, you don't just get up and say, I am ready, sign me on to the program. You have to go through some, arrangements, meetings. The first of all is you have to send what we call the letter of intent to IMF for them to approve it. You yourself, you have to draw the program, own it, and say, this is what I want to do. I need your support. So the IMF will look at your program, and then they will help you, being the external supervisor of your own program and say, okay, this is what you've brought. This is the amounts we can give you, and we will help you to, achieve these things that you said you are going to do. So government will first of all have to send a letter of intent to the IMF, come back to draw a plan, send it to the IMF for the IMF to also have some, meetings and other things. So it could take weeks, but it's clear that the government is late because if you look at the Article 4, that was released by the IMF somewhere 2021, July last year. It was clear that that was the time Ghana should have taken the advantage to actually confront the IMF and opt for a program. But we've waited a year on, 2020 July, 2022 July, and it's been a year, and it's clear we've delayed. It's going to take some weeks and probably months before the IMF will come in to say, look, this is what we have, and this is what we can give you.
But one thing I pick from your explanation is that probably then this has been on the drawing board for a long time because you said you have to write a letter of intent, come and draw a program. Now, according to the Information Minister's letter, they are inviting the IMF to come and look at a program they've put together.
Exactly.
Which means that the letter of intent might have gone earlier than now. Interesting. But we're told that we're not going to go to the IMF.
Well,
anyway, thank you very much. Let's broaden the conversation here on the pause by joining the former finance minister, the man who was in charge when we went there during the Mahama administration, Mr. Seth Terkper. Thank you so much, sir. We are grateful for your time. Now, what are your thoughts about government's decision to now finally to return to the IMF?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to your viewers. And to your listeners. Let me just, before I go to your question, let me point out two things. At the time,
Mr. Terkper is still with us on
we
line,
went to the IMF, we had one oil field. At the time we are going now, we have three oil fields. That suggests that we could have done, better. And if you consider, yes, we did have, crises like COVID and the rest, but we had nearly $6 billion to resolve those crises compared to no flows, even though we had a program, when we had single spine and we had, the disruption in gas supply and others. So I think sometimes the analysis should go a bit in detail. Okay. The second point I wish to point out is that, you don't compare the old basis with the new basis. It appears that the 2015 was on the old basis. I mean, it is clear that at the time we handed over in 2016, the debt to GDP ratio was not 65, it was 57%, approximately. That either means the basis is wrong or that there was improvement, under the program before, we handed over. And therefore, it means that it probably shows a marked deterioration, between the time that we handed over, and now, worse than what was shown in your analysis. But that is just, to point out a couple of things.
Sure.
The question has always been put. There were suggestions very early on that the situation was deteriorating, as your introduction indicated, and therefore we needed to do something quickly. We then later on, I was of the view when I was questioning back then that, we probably was time to start looking at going to the fund. And we can go later on into why developing countries go to the IMF. But then later on when the government stance was firm that we were not going, we asked the question, where is the alternative? The closest that came to an alternative was the budget, with the medium-term indicators which did not impress. And we rather had downgrades, and warnings from the same IMF and the World Bank about the sustainability of the debt. Remember, even the World Bank president suggested, I believe in a question by Joe FM, I believe George Biafi, what we needed to do, and his answer was clear that we should, get the suspension, the very thing which the president has been addressing. So it is true that we are where we are because we've run out of options. Yes, there has been some delay. But let me also put something in context. Remember, there was a staff visit. I don't think it was announced, but there was a staff visit earlier this year. And that staff visit, we are not sure whether it was meant as an Article 4. So when the finance minister, information minister talks about, agreeing on having some understanding, with the fund, it may have come out of that staff, visit. That means staff visit by the IMF. And that clearly suggests that probably there were background discussions taking place around the time of the spring meetings, when the staff was in Washington and after. If that is the case, and that is the input, then probably a negotiation may be faster, than your projection, because then you recall the same situation prevailed when we had a homegrown policy which we provided as input, after. And by the way, it was because we didn't get budget support, and we had to be pragmatic and realistic that without it, it was going to be difficult to push through the homegrown policy. And that was why at Senchi it was decided, to go to the fund. So we may be seeing a similar scenario where some information may have been shared. And that should probably point to one important lesson, that whether you claim to exit the IMF or not, under the Article 4, you are obliged to engage the fund, to have discussions with them. And it's inevitable to the government that once there has been these tough discussions and the rest, the facts will come out anyway about the true position, of the country, which may worsen. Probably the reporting was due and may worsen the position that we have with the markets and the rest. So this is to probably avert and advisory. That's why I said probably avert further downgrades and things, which definitely would have taken the country closer to, default, because that was looking at the tightness that we were facing, non-access to the external markets, and then the domestic markets not being able to support, the government's expenditure deficit. We were getting to a point where it was becoming very delicate if we were not careful. I'm glad that, voices like that of senior people like Dr. Kwame PNM, Dr. Ismail Jensen and a few, has been heeded or taken into account probably by cabinet in the discussions, and so we are where we are, and we'll look up to probably more information on this, if not, in the short term, definitely by the end of the month when the mid-year review, which is now statutory, is presented to Parliament.
Okay. Now, you've been there before. You've managed the economy of Ghana. At this point, what could be the possible implication of this decision to run back to the IMF? What are we looking at?
Well, we are looking at the deficit, that was widening, because recall that even though we are giving the deficit, debt, and other indicators, we had the rating agencies, the fund and others coming out with different figures. At the end of the year, once we said we were below 70, 80, some indicators show that we were probably at 83. We now know that the arrears provision is woefully inadequate, considering the amount which the contractors, school feeding, contractors included, and others are indicated that they are owed. I already mentioned the tightness in the markets, our inability, to access the external markets, the domestic markets not being too responsive to bonds until we started increasing interest rates, which has implications for crowding and interest rates for the domestic market. So I think all these factors, were coming to a head, and we were getting to the point where it was going to be difficult, because if you take the terms under which they were going to get a syndicated loan has been floated. It's floating all over the place. And you can see the draconian terms under which we were going to go, insurance, and then payment for likely, defaults and other things, all of these are front. Suspension, of the effectiveness of repayment. And the other thing that was circulating was the maturity dates for our bonds from 2025 to 20 onwards, or 2026 onwards in particular. The zero coupon, for which we got only 350 of the face value of 550, they were supposed to pay 500 or 550. So you can see, rare mountain of developments which were not in favor, of the fiscal situation of the country. And I believe that we can say for Bank of Ghana, that they have pointed to the fiscal situation for a while. Remember that two other points quickly. For this year, we have some relief. If you look at the budget from the SDR, which is in financing. So, but for the SDR, our financing situation would have been worse. So you see, that's one factor. Then last year, or 2020 rather, we had Bank of Ghana financing the deficit to the extent of 7% of GDP, which was about half the size of the deficit. And they did not blame it on COVID. What they said, clearly was that if the government were going to go to the markets, it was going to borrow at high interest rates, which would be inimical to the domestic market developments. And this was the time we were also getting significant flows, right? Which led some of us to say that, look, if you are getting significant flows, including Bank of Ghana, which is deficit financing and all that in 2020, then what was the true situation in 2019? The very IMF we are discussing now had then published the Article 19, which suggests that there was a wider gap of about 5%. I urge your producers to look at it. And then the COVID report also came up and confirmed that wider gap. That is, you have to make some corrections, in those statements. So clearly, our situation, even though the letter is pointing to Ukraine and others, COVID, and frankly, our situation was deteriorating very fast before those facts, and not even the major inflow of nearly 5 to 6 billion US dollars, which is about 30 billion if you take even as 6%, a low exchange rate. About half of what GRA was bringing in could salvage the situation. The issue is what expenditure was driving the deficit, right? Clearly, GRA was not bringing in enough revenue, but GRA was operating, around 12%. Yes. So what expenditure is it that was driving the situation such that GRA revenue was not sufficient, non-tax revenue was not sufficient, COVID inflows were not sufficient, loans that we had taken, significant amounts, which are taken into distress, were not sufficient. All of these were supposed to be financing. All of this was supposed to be financing one expenditure. And that is what we are not talking about. Right? What expenditure level, right, is taken? And you can see in this year's budget that the expenditure is 137 billion, and we are expecting 100. So 37 billion was supposed to be financed externally. So I would hope that you would turn the conversation to the expenditure that is driving the process, because Ghanaians might prepare their minds, if we are going to do a true program, to some of those expenditures changing. And we would hope that there will be optimum disclosure if there was some discussion in the package that was being discussed, that Ghanaians will be informed about which types of expenditure we are going to, are going to suffer.
Mr. Tebek, can we predict the sort of expenditure that was taking a lot from us that probably, if checked, can help us be successful on that program?
Well, clearly, you don't have your regular expenditure compensation interest payments. So let's start with those ones. Even for those ones, we know that compensation is regular, but as a result of using the public sector as a means of employment, NAPCO, etc., and the rest, which today have arrears, there's a new program which is supposed to cater for them, tells us that using the public sector, the civil service in particular, to create jobs is not sustainable, which is why we had the infrastructure approach. We're heavily criticized for that. Secondly, interest shows that much of that expenditure, including what I'm going to follow next, are being financed by loan. And then we just kept refinancing, such that, even interest was taking significant amounts of revenue. And then you have recurrent expenditure, capital expenditure, amortization, all of these now falling, on debt, for financing. And yes, still, despite this pressure, we are being told that arrears are owing. When in actual fact, the budget has made provision for only 1.9 billion, Ghana cedis of arrears. And we kept pushing bailout costs below the line, instead of treating it properly as exceptional expenditure. Bailout costs in relation to the banking sector. Energy sector was being buried, if you remember, 2019, 2020, the debate that went on in Parliament in amortization. It wasn't being shown, as an expenditure item. And by the way, your introduction, at the time, your introduction from Parliament, you could hear some of the reasons that has taken us to this place. For example, talk about bailout costs being the result for the increase in the debt when there was no talk about ESLA. What happened to the ESLA revenue? Because, and those things were kept, quiet. Because ESLA was meant to resolve, those revenues. Of course, aspects like, the current debt, including past debt, without talking about the projects, like the flyover, at Pokwasi, how do you call it, the railway line to Akosombu, and all of which are part of the debt. You don't talk about the debt, something increasing debt, and not talk about the benefits of the tangible projects, that were there. So you could see the sort of, a misconception that was being created, around that time, when it was obvious that the government should have faced up to the, to the problem. So I think we are where we are, and we'll just wait for, the contents, of whatever has been agreed with the fund to continue with the conversation.
Well, Mr. Tepe, this whole argument about expenditure, we've had it in the past. I mean, you've spoken a lot about cutting down expenditure. It hasn't helped. Around the IMF roundtable, where we decide on what to do, what do they bring? What do they tell us to do? If you look at it, what will be the demand of the IMF such that we'll be able to cut down this whole expenditure that has become the probably in quote the case of where we are?
You see, your colleague gave a very vital and important information. The fund does not see a program as their program. The fund sees a program as an outcome of discussions after proposals are made by the government of Ghana.
Okay.
And that is the essence of what he was talking about, the letter of intent. We are giving them an intent. And in that letter of intent, you also have what you call the Memorandum of Economic and Financial Policy, which is attached, signed by the Minister for Finance and by the Central Bank Governor. Yes, of course, the fund will come in. They know our numbers because they've been coming for visits and everything. And they would make, inputs, and they will make suggestions, because remember, you are borrowing from them. And they would definitely want a program. It's just like going to your bank, that is sustainable, that can repay their facility. That is a crucial point. So I think we should take, which is why we took the view that we should have a homegrown policy, which, even though we did not end up implementing in full, it included some of the measures like sinking fund, the stabilization fund. I think we know the benefits of those programs, but now the contingency fund, which were used in various ways, including the COVID, right? So a similar proposal is going to come from the government of Ghana. And in our case, we were talking about expenditure. Let me mention, in our case, and especially even after we had negotiated the program, if you remember, ESLA was not part of, the IMF program. ESLA was our initiative.
Okay.
The fund did not even, know that we're considering ESLA, because coming out of Doom, we realized that we needed.
Let me ask for a favor. Kindly hold the line for us. Let's take our viewers to Parliament now, where there are already reactions. Ranking member on Parliament's Finance Committee, Dr. KCL Atuforsen, describes the decision to go to the IMF as refreshing, but coming late. He also says the current debt stock of the country will make it difficult for government to get a program with the IMF. Parliamentary correspondent Kweku Asante joins us with more. Kweku, what are the parliamentarians saying?
So, Brace, this news dropped like a bombshell in the House. Indeed, it is not as though MPs were not expecting that such a decision will be taken by the Finance Ministry. But given the insistence of Ken Ofori-Atta that government was not going to seek an IMF support, this came in a bit surprising. At the time the Information Ministry statement was published, you could see MPs passing their phones to each other, ostensibly giving the information out to them. And so I made contacts with the ranking on the Finance Committee, the minority spokesperson on finance, Kese Latoforsen, who said that government had waited too long before calling for this support from the IMF. Indeed, his argument was that if you look at the current debt position of the country, it will make it difficult for government to get a better deal with the IMF, if not such a high stance from the IMF. Indeed, when the IMF come in, they will be looking at government accepting some status of the economy before they can finalize in terms of what agreement they will be doing. And so he thought that the debt position of the government will make the debt to GDP ratio in terms of what deal government gets from the IMF quite unstable and quite not in the favor of Ghanaians. I also spoke with Sam George, who said that in the coming future, the side were not going to support any decision by government to seek any more loans. We know that currently before Parliament is a $1 billion syndicated loan agreement with some consortium of banks. And yesterday when John Dramani Mahama spoke, he gave marching orders to NDC MPs not to support any such agreement. And the NDC MPs are ready to comply with these marching orders from the former president. But they are saying, the minority side, that this decision by government to finally seek an IMF bailout is testament to government's ineptitude and government's poor handling of the economy, and that it had been coming long time ago. But briefly, this issue also came up on the floor. Indeed, at the time the Agric Minister was answering questions on fertilizers, the IMF, I beg your pardon, the NDC minority members started shouting IMF, IMF, IMF. And then the Deputy Majority Leader, Honorable Afenyo Makin, got up and started explaining that the decision by government to go for IMF, to go for an IMF support, was a candid one that was taken because of the troubles in Ukraine, and also the kind of challenges that COVID-19 has brought. And so it was a very candid decision, unlike the NDC, who went to the IMF in 2015 because they have simply mismanaged the economy. But Minority Leader Haruna Idrisu pushed back and said that Afenyo Makin was not a finance minister to be announcing that decision on the floor of Parliament. It became a bit of a back and forth between both sides. But this message has been received with shock, especially, like I told you earlier on, because of Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta's insistence. We've also been speaking with Isaac Adongo, who says the Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta must be sacked, because having said that he was not going to go to the IMF, if government's decision to go to the IMF now, where the finance minister now supposed to lead the team to negotiate a deal, he will do so in bad faith, and so he should step aside for someone else to lead the team. Brice.
Correspondent Kweko Asante there. Well, we still have Honorable Seth Tekpe on the line. Honorable, so as we heard there from my colleague, Kese Latoforsen believes that it will be difficult for us to get any program with the IMF. Do you agree with him? Kindly unmute so we can hear what you're telling us. Okay, so...
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Yeah, so I was trying to find out from you that Dr. Kese Latoforsen believes that it will be difficult, looking at our circumstances, to get any program with the IMF. And I want to find out from you, since you've been at the helm of affairs of the finance ministry and managing our economy, do you agree that it will be difficult for us to get a program now?
Hello? Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
There is a seriousness with the negotiation of every IMF program. Because remember, you don't go to the IMF, I keep saying, you don't go to the IMF when times are good. You normally go to the IMF because times have deteriorated, and often because, you've run out of options yourself. But the IMF, that is one of the reasons the IMF is established, to help member countries. So I would hope that there would be a goodwill, sufficient goodwill. Yes, despite, I don't believe that the IMF, as an institution, would have been Ghana would have been the first. They would have seen saying we are not going to the IMF, and then we ended up going to the IMF. So I would hope that that goodwill, that long relationship we have had with the fund, will prevail, because otherwise then things would deteriorate. And I would want to believe the information minister that if there have been some discussions, then obviously the situation has been described to them. His Excellency the President himself is said, to have spoken, to the managing director of the IMF, who had called earlier on, for Ghana to watch his death situation and all that. So I think there will be that goodwill. But yes, like all IMF programs, it will take some time to negotiate. The IMF, as I said, also has some information. They came for a staff visit. Okay. And that is the
so Mr. Tepe, two quick questions, then we can wrap our conversation. So if you look at how things are running now, we've had issues about job losses, non-employment when this IMF comes to town. Is that something we should expect when we finally agree to a program with them?
Well, some of those things were discussed. As I said, we are going to ask us, all our revenue is going into, compensation and interest. We know the reason, using the civil service as a means of generating employment. And we know it's not sustainable. We know that we have been borrowing to sustain free FHS. Now we cannot borrow. So the question is to ourselves, not to the fund, sincerely, whether this.
Mr. Tepe, so I just wanted to find out from you, is it true that they ask us not to employ people when we are with the fund? Is that what comes to the table in agreeing?
Well, there's some of that. But some of that, remember, I mentioned the letter of intent, and your producers can go back and look at, the letter of intent that we signed. Some of the issues that the MPP was using to distort our program. You wouldn't see anywhere there that we had entered into an agreement with the fund, to cut employment. We went into a program, we're doing the single spine, and it was about managing the single spine and making sure that, the arrears and other things will be settled. So now that they are going to do a program, one would hope, that there will be some dispassionate discussion. I know the distortions that were being peddled. But let me make another point.
Okay.
I think
Mr. Tepe, I'm grateful for the point you raised. But why are we not able to manage our economy? Why is it that we always run to the IMF to tell them that it looks like we cannot be left on our own? Definitely we'll run back to them. Why can't we?
Let me tell you that we should be making comparisons of programs and initiatives. Since when did we go into a crisis like COVID and we went into our own kitty and took out 250 million? If as we speak now, it is getting to 400 million in the name of COVID from a stabilization fund to support a crisis, the reason that you go to the IMF. Could the situation have been different if after 3 oil fields and when times were good, we had continued and we probably would have had 700 million? Would we therefore be going, would it not be understandable to say that ordinarily we would have required 1 billion, but we're able to get only 250 from the IMF because we have our own 750, million. Secondly, is it credible to say that we had a bond that was coming up in 2014, 2017? We realized this by 2013, 14, and we started putting funds aside on our own from the new petroleum resources that were flowing. By 2016, we had used 336 million to take off part of that loan. We refinanced 200 million from the sovereign bond, and we left 200 million of balance in the sinking fund for the NPP to use to take off the first sovereign bond on our own, 550 of our own money.
Okay.
I'm suggesting to you that we started initiatives, which are the very ones that would have prevented us from going to the IMF.
Okay.
And these were from our homegrown policy. And we can talk some more about it. We started doing self-financing.
Mr. Tepe, I'm grateful to you because we would have to leave it here. But definitely, we'll still come back to have this conversation. I'm so grateful that you agreed to join us. He is the former finance minister, Seth Tepe there. But still, Kofi Eje is with me. But so, he spoke to us about expenditure. Yeah. What is our expenditure like in the first quarter of 2022?
Well, you should know that totally this year, government is expecting to spend an amount of, just like he said, 137 billion Ghana cedis and raise 100.5 billion cedis. Now, this leaves you with almost close to 40 billion cedis of deficit to actually fund. Now, before I came in studio, we're looking at the research desk, we're looking at government's, what we call the fiscal data released by the finance ministry. And it actually gives, although it's provisional data, it gives you a fair idea of how much government is spending in the first quarter. So in terms of expenditure, government had spent somewhere close to 26 billion Ghana cedis on several items. Okay. And just like he said, what is really pulling the economy back? Two things, what we spend on compensations and also what we spend as interest payments, not even paying off the
loans.
Exactly. Okay. So if you look at the data, I want to compare it to tax, because that's very important. We collected a total amount of 12.9 billion cedis as tax revenue in the first quarter, provisional. Now, out of this money, if we compare how much we spent on paying interest, that's 10.5 billion cedis as interest. It's going out to pay, we are just paying them as interest payments.
We collected 12
billion and pay out 10.5 billion as interest payments. Wow. Now, if you add interest payments, which is 10.5 billion cedis, and what we paid to employees as compensations, that's around somewhere 7.5 billion. The total is around somewhere 18.5 billion. If you compare to what we raise as tax revenue, it means it can't even cover these two line items. We will need additional 5.3 billion cedis to supplement it. You get it. So it means that there's really an expenditure item which is really pulling the economy back, and then depreciation of the cedi is not really helping at the moment. Bruce.
So that's Kofi Eje. He is a researcher with our research desk. Well, we have quite a number of reactions to this news on social media. MP for Ningo Pram constituency, Samuel Nate George, says, now this is what he has put on his tweet, and I'll be sharing that with you quite shortly here on the show. This is still the Pulse on Joy News, and we are bringing you reactions to the news about Ghana deciding finally to go for an IMF program. On your screen now is what the MP for Ningo Pram, Samuel Jata George, has tweeted. He says, well, we are going back to the IMF for a program. Finally, common sense is prevailing. Well, that's his thoughts there. Well, on Thursday, former President John Mahama took a swipe at the government for how they've managed the economy. But let's do some more reactions and go on the phone line now and speak to Dr. Sarkodie, for some discussions on this decision of government to run to the IMF. He is an economist and joining us to share with us the perspective of an economist. Doc, thank you so much for your time. How was your reaction in the instance you saw this statement out that finally government is considering a program with the IMF?
I wasn't surprised at all. It was coming. Government has run out of options. The options which were before them were to pass the e-levy and rating revenue, to build confidence, to send a signal to the international community that they can mobilize domestic revenue to service their debt. They all did not materialize. So because government had run out of options, it was necessary for them to go to the IMF. Now, going to the IMF right now is a necessity. I'm not sure government has any other option than to go to the IMF. And let us not demonize going to IMF. Ghana is a member of the IMF. We took 1 billion special drawing right from them because we're a member. And it's because in the past, this administration criticized the previous one for going to the IMF. That is why there seems to be some politics in whether to go or not to go. But economically speaking, when you are in dire need at a time when you have fiscal imbalances, your macro instability, everything else is going out of hand, and you have to seek help from them to help you stabilize your economy. I think it's stability that we need. We need, first of all, there's a need for inflow of funds. So no matter the program the government has, if you are not getting financing for it, it's not going to work. And so the IMF program is supposed to give us some funds and also give government some policy credibility so that other multinationals or multilaterals and even bilaterals can come in to support. I wouldn't even be surprised if African Development Bank or World Bank come in to support even within the IMF program. And also that, they would instill discipline in government fiscal discipline to manage the finances well, to mobilize revenue and also manage the expenditures well, cut all the waste and all that. So, yes, we are in need of it. But truth be told that I have not seen IMF program that is about industrialization or economic growth or job creation. It's not usually for long-term development, like that. So they will just give you stability, and whatever you do with the stability is up to you. So let us not. I don't think the government should just sit down and say, "Oh, we are in the hands of IMF, and therefore we are going to sleep." No, they will leave. Maybe after 2 years or 3 years, they will leave, and then after they are giving you the stability, and you have to use the stability to grow your economy and develop it to create the jobs that you want.
But Doc, I'll come back to you with the same question. Why does it look as though we are not able to manage our own affairs and would always need the IMF to keep us in check? Why that?
Because we are fiscally indisciplined as a country. If you mess up, you go to them. If you don't want to mess up, then, you discipline yourself and manage yourself well. We have not been able to manage ourselves well. We bring in policies here and there without critically looking at the cost-benefit analysis. We don't do evaluation before we implement. I say we, I'm using the word we because I'm a Ghanaian, and so I'm talking about governments that have come and gone. And so we just put up programs and policies just because it will win us votes, not because they are economically viable ventures. That has been the problem, just for the vote. And whether it will collapse the economy or not, they don't care. So we are not fiscally disciplined as a country. Our managers have not been fiscally disciplined, and the IMF will breathe down your neck and discipline you. So if you don't want that, then we have to discipline ourselves. But at this time run, we know that, we have our own internal problems, but we know also the problems from the COVID and the war. But somebody will say, but the Ivory Coast is also in the war and is experiencing the effect of COVID, like Togo is also experiencing the effect of COVID and the war. So why Ghana? So the problem still remains that we have our own internal problems. We saw how the cedi depreciated against all the major trading currencies within the first quarter of this year. And so that is not a Togolese problem, that's not an Ivorian problem, that's a Ghanaian problem. And so the weaknesses in the structure of our economy, we have to deal with it. Other than that, we'll go back to them again.
Yes, so Doc, at the end of the day, at the end of the IMF program, we are looking at the fact that we wouldn't have to have them around all the time. So we have to look at solutions. How do we do it? What should we do to ensure that we won't run back to the IMF again in the near future?
Have a plan as a country. What's our plan? We don't seem to have a plan. Even if we have a plan, we don't implement it. There's always a divergence between what is implemented and what is written on the paper. The political parties, they come and go, they implement what is in their manifesto at the expense of long-term solution. And then, we saw what they were even doing to senior high school. Somebody says 4 years, another person says 3 years. Somebody says 3 years, another person saying, no, we'll do it gradually. So we don't have a plan as a nation. We just do things anyhow. There are areas that may need the interchange. They don't take those things to those areas. They just go and build the interchange in areas that may not need it. If you go and promise areas like Cape Coast and Ho Airport, what do they need it for? They would need rather a railway station. If you have a very efficient railway station, you don't need an airport. That is efficient for even the, what we call, the ordinary Ghanaian to afford. So let us have a plan as a nation and follow the plan and stop all these politics, NDC, MPP thing. It's not going to help us. When MPP is in power, NDC makes sure that they fail. When NDC is in power, MPP makes sure that they fail so that they can get the vote. This better of, what do we even call it, the better of two devils, it's not good at all. I want to see an argument between an MPP and NDC saying that I was better than you, instead of you were worse than me. If it's always the better of two devils, then it's going to affect all of us. So let us have the plan and follow it.
Doc, thank you so much for your time. Doc Edu Owusu-Sarkodie is an economist, and he's been sharing his thought on the decision by the Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo-led MPP government to finally return to the IMF for a program. Well, on Thursday, former President John Mahama took a swipe at the government, expressing concern about the government's refusal to go to the IMF. Take a listen.
The administration knows this too well, but political posturing, empty grandstanding, and a morbid fear of their own pedestrian politicking around less serious problems of the recent past have immobilized and frozen them into action. Inaction which continues to run our economy aground and worsening the living conditions of our people by the day. And with this, I'm referring to their criticism of my administration when we decided to go to the IMF. They said it's only lazy governments that go to the IMF. And I mean, the words they said in that past have come to haunt them. So one of the reasons why they're afraid to go to the IMF is that what they said in the past will follow them.
All right, so this is still the pulse. We'll take a quick break here, but we'll try and bring you some reactions on social media, how Ghanaians are reacting to this news of government finally taking a decision to return to the IMF for a program. Stay with us. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.